My name is Dr. Mariana Albuquerque. I have been an intensivist physician for 15 years, dedicated mainly to critical care in the ICU. During this time, I have faced situations that push any professional to the limit, and that often go beyond what science can explain. I had always prepared myself to rely on technique, statistics, and machines, but the reality of the hospital showed me that life insists on surprising us in ways we never learn from books. From the beginning of my career, I thought it would be enough to follow strict protocols and make quick decisions to save lives. But the years have taught me that it is not always like that. There are moments when every resource fails, when every attempt seems useless, and even so, something happens. Something that goes beyond what we can measure in exams or explain in medical reports. In those moments, medicine reaches an unknown territory where faith, hope, and mystery seem to unite. I want to welcome you who are here, listening to me. What I am about to share is not just another clinical case, it is an experience that deeply marked my journey and that still echoes in my memory today. Every detail of that night remains alive within me. The incessant noise of the monitors, the cold air of the room, the tense looks of the team. It is impossible to forget, because it was one of those episodes that divide a career into before and after. And I am not telling this story to create a spectacle. I tell it because I believe we need to talk about these events that go beyond logic. Not to diminish science, it remains my foundation, my guide in every decision, but to acknowledge that there is something greater, something beyond our control. Something that, sometimes, decides to intervene at the exact moment when we have nothing else left to offer. The case I am going to report is of a patient who collapsed before our eyes. We did everything within our reach, every protocol, every maneuver. And when we believed it was the end, when there were no more signs of life, something happened that no medical explanation has been able to answer to this day. This is the story I want you to follow with me now. Get ready, because this is not just about medicine. It is an encounter between science and mystery, between despair and hope, between what can be explained and what can only be felt. He was declared dead. Everyone in the room had lowered their arms, but suddenly, something happened. Something that, to this day, I cannot explain. That is how one of the most intense experiences of my life as a doctor begins. And before I continue this account, I need your help. For this video to reach more people and stories like this not to be forgotten, I need at least 100 comments. So, write down here, "I believe in miracles." This simple phrase may seem small, but it is exactly what helps YouTube deliver this content to more people. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity and subscribe now. Here I share real hospital stories, cases that deeply marked my professional life and that can also touch your heart. Because, in the end, each story like this does not belong only to me or to the patient, it belongs to all of us, who seek to understand how far science can go. And where the mystery begins. That night, inside the hospital, the atmosphere was heavy with silence, interrupted only by the sound of the heart monitors that suddenly went mute. The patient no longer responded. The team was exhausted, each of us had done everything possible. And then, the phrase that echoes in my mind to this day, was spoken by one of my colleagues. "There is nothing else to be done." Those words, which sounded like a period, marked the moment when we all believed the story was over. The emotional weight of that moment is indescribable. We doctors train to accept the inevitable, to understand that we will not always win the battle against death. But in that case, what came next shattered any certainty I had. That is why I want you to stay with me until the end of this video, because you will understand, step by step, how a scenario that seemed irreversible transformed before our eyes. And more than that, you will realize how certain things cannot be explained by statistics, protocols, or technology. What happened that night was not just a curious detail or a clinical coincidence. It was something that made me rethink my own profession. It was as if the impossible had chosen to manifest itself at the very moment when everyone had given up. And I, who had always trusted reason above all else, had to face the possibility that there is something beyond what we can measure and control. So, if you have ever experienced or witnessed something that seemed to have no explanation, you will connect deeply with this story. And if you never have, get ready, because listening to this account may change the way you see life, medicine, and even faith. Leave your comment. Right now. Write, "I believe in miracles." And let us dive together into this narrative where the boundary between life and death was crossed by something none of us expected. It was late afternoon when I received the call. That day was already marked by an overload of patients, a crowded ER, desperate families in the hallway, and every bed occupied with stories of pain, hope, and the struggle for life. However, among so many cases, one in particular caught my attention from the very beginning. The patient was a 47-year-old man named Carlos Eduardo, a tireless worker, father of 2 teenage children, known by everyone in his city as a generous person, always ready to help. Carlos had been rushed in by paramedics after suffering a sudden cardiorespiratory arrest at home. His wife, desperate, had tried to resuscitate him until the emergency team arrived, and when he entered RR, his life was already hanging by a thread. I remember the expression on her face when she arrived along with the stretcher. Her pale face, eyes red from so much crying, and a phrase she kept repeating insistently: "Please, doctor, don't let him die. He can't leave me like this." Those words echoed in me in a different way. It was as if the weight of that plea had turned into double the responsibility on my shoulders. Carlos's medical history revealed some concerning factors: uncontrolled hypertension, family history of heart problems, and recently, symptoms of fatigue that he had ignored. Like so many men who put work above everything else, he had not paid attention to the signs his body was sending. The truth is that, on that stretcher, there wasn't just a patient, there was a father, a husband, a son, and more than that, someone who carried with him the hope of an entire family. The minutes that followed were of absolute urgency. The team went into action with precision. Intubation, chest compressions, medications administered, each procedure carried out by the book. The sound of the machines filled the room while we alternated between maneuvers and glances of complicity, as if silently asking, "Will we be able to bring him back?" The atmosphere was dense, almost palpable. I watched his wife's face through the small window of the room, where she leaned against the wall, too weak to stand. It was impossible not to feel that woman's pain. As a doctor, I had learned to maintain emotional distance, but as a human being, there is no training that can shield us from the vulnerability of others. Every tear rolling down her face seemed to remind us that we were not just fighting against statistics, but for a life that sustained other lives. Carlos was not just a number in a chart. He was the father who taught his children how to play soccer in the street, the husband who made sure to be present at birthdays, the man who worked overtime to give his family a better life. And now, all of that was at risk of being wiped out in a matter of minutes. As we monitored his vital signs, the flat line on the electrocardiogram seemed to mock our efforts. Every second that passed was a blow against hope. We knew that the longer without response, the smaller the chances of reversal. Even so, no one gave up. Because giving up meant accepting that this story would end right there, abruptly and cruelly. I watched Carlos's body and, silently, repeated to myself, "You need to fight a little longer. Not for us, but for those waiting for you outside." It was almost an intimate request, a prayer disguised as thought. The initial context of this case was not just a severe clinical condition, it was the combination of science, humanity, and despair. And in that moment, as Carlos's life seemed to slip through our hands, I knew we were about to enter a territory where medicine would be tested to the limit. The clock seemed to run against us. Every passing second increased the weight of urgency, as if time itself were an implacable enemy inside that room. Carlos's heart remained in absolute silence, and the flat line on the monitor was a cruel reminder of life's fragility. We had followed every protocol, repeated every resuscitation maneuver, and still, nothing. I knew, as did the entire team, that we were entering dangerous territory. The chances of reversal decreased with every minute without cardiac electrical activity. Even so, no one dared step back. The chest compressions continued firmly, sweat dripped down my colleagues' faces, and exhaustion became visible in every look. But the tension was not only physical, it was emotional. We all knew what was at stake. "Adrenaline, one more time," I asked firmly, trying to control the voice that threatened to tremble. The medication was administered, and for a few seconds the environment seemed frozen. All eyes fixed on the monitor, waiting for some spark of life to appear. But nothing happened. Only that electronic silence, accompanied by the heavy breathing of the team. It was at that moment that I heard, behind me, the phrase no doctor likes to hear. "Doctor, we've already been at this for more than 20 minutes. The insinuation was clear. Maybe it was time to consider the obvious, to accept that the fight had come to an end. But I couldn't. Something inside me screamed that it was not time to give up yet. I continued the protocol. More compressions, more medication, more attempts. Each step followed with precision, but also with a growing sense of helplessness. I looked at Carlos and did not see just an inert body. I saw the story of a man abruptly interrupted. I saw his wife on the other side of the door, desperate, waiting for news that could shatter her life. The conflict inside me was as intense as what was unfolding in the room. As a doctor, I knew there was a limit. There were statistics, there were clinical parameters indicating when reversal became practically impossible. But as a human being, as someone who had already seen life manifest in the most unlikely moments, I simply could not give up. The team began to show signs of discouragement. Eyes averted, some movements slower. It was as if everyone was waiting for my final word, the one that would officially end the attempt. But I hesitated. Something told me to go on, even though reason screamed the opposite. Then I asked for another round of maneuvers. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Not because the room was quiet, but because hope seemed to have run out. One of my colleagues murmured, "Doctor, sometimes we need to accept." Those words struck me like a blade. I knew he was right, but inside me, a resistance persisted, like an insistent voice saying, "It's not over yet." The minutes turned into eternity. The atmosphere filled with almost tangible tension, as if the air had become too heavy to breathe. I saw the exhaustion etched on everyone's faces, but I also saw something else, the pain of admitting that despite all efforts, we might lose that life. At that moment, I realized we were facing a limit not only of medicine, but also of our own faith in ourselves. Because when the protocol runs out, what remains? When the hands have already done everything possible, what is the next step? It was at that threshold, between science and surrender, that I felt the entire room plunge into a kind of void. The void of the impossible. The void of helplessness. And it was exactly in that void that something unexpected began to happen. That room was immersed in silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of chest compressions that already seemed mechanical, almost automatic. Time had lost its meaning. 20, 30 minutes. It was impossible to be sure. All I knew was that every extra second increased the unbearable weight of defeat. I felt the team's eyes on me, waiting for me to give the final order. The order that would end the resuscitation attempt, officially confirming what no one wanted to admit, Carlos's death. I took a deep breath. My hands trembled discreetly, but my voice remained firm. One more time. And it was at that moment that something happened. On the monitor, which until then had shown only the relentless flat line, a small oscillation appeared. So faint that, at first, I thought it was an artifact, a machine error. But then it repeated, a tiny trace, almost invisible. That seemed to silently scream, "It's not over yet." "Stop for a second," I asked, holding my breath. The air grew heavy, as if everyone were holding their breath along with me. And then, before our eyes, that timid line turned into a clearer wave. A slow rhythm, fragile but real. Carlos's heart was beating again. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time had frozen inside that room. The team's eyes met, incredulous. Some even murmured, "It's not possible." I myself couldn't believe what I was seeing. Statistically, clinically, it made no sense. After so long without cardiac activity, the chances were practically zero. And yet, the impossible was happening right before us. Suddenly, the environment that had been heavy with defeat turned into a whirlwind of emotion. The monitor, once mute, now pulsed with a sound that felt like music to our ears. Beep, beep, beep. A sound that meant life, resistance, return. Tears welled up in one of the nurse's eyes. Another colleague, in shock, put his hand to his head, murmuring softly, "I've never seen anything like this." And I kept silent for a few seconds, trying to absorb the scene, because inside me, an overwhelming mix of feelings intertwined: relief, disbelief, gratitude. I looked again at the monitor, as if wanting to confirm every second that it wasn't an illusion. But it wasn't. The heart was there, beating, reclaiming what everyone had already given up for lost. I then approached Carlos's face. His skin was still cold, his body still frail. But something in him seemed to have changed. I can't explain exactly. It was as if there were a presence in the room. Something invisible but undeniable. Some would call it a miracle. Others, a coincidence. For me, in that moment, the name didn't matter. What mattered was that life had returned where there had been nothing. His wife, outside the door, still didn't know anything. But I could imagine her reaction when she heard. The man who had been declared lifeless had returned. That climax was not just a medical turnaround. It was a shock of reality, a reminder that we are not always in control. It was as if a greater force had decided to intervene, rewriting a story that already seemed finished. And looking back, I confess, I still haven't found an explanation. There is no protocol to justify it, no statistic to support it. The only thing I know is that night, we witnessed something that transcends science, something that can only be described as unexplainable. When I saw that trace appear on the monitor, Carlos's heart beating again after so many minutes of silence, a whirlwind of emotions overwhelmed me. The entire room was in shock, and no wonder. Medicine teaches us to calculate probabilities, to coldly evaluate the chances of success. And in that case, all the statistics were against us. But, before our eyes, something happened. Something that was not in the books, not in the charts, not in the protocols. And in that instant, I realized that medicine, no matter how advanced, cannot encompass all dimensions of life. As I looked at the monitor, I thought about how many times I had already told families that there was nothing else to be done. How many times I had been the face delivering the hardest news someone can hear. And for a moment, I felt a different weight. What if there are forces acting beyond what we can see? Forces that, in rare moments, decide to intervene. I am not saying science fails, it is the foundation of everything we do. But the experience of that night reminded me that there is a fine line between what we control and what we cannot explain. And when that line is crossed, the result can be so surprising that it forces us to rethink our certainties. I knew we were not out of danger yet. Carlos had returned, but his body was fragile, and every second from then on would be critical. There were no guarantees, no certainty of full recovery. And even so, a flame of hope had been reignited, not only in him, but in all of us. And I want you, who are following this story, to think with me. How many times in your life have you felt that everything was lost? How many times did it seem like there was no way out, and suddenly something changed? It may have been a detail, an unexpected encounter, an answer that came at the last moment. These moments remind us that, even when logic points to an end, life always finds ways to surprise us. In that room, we were still surrounded by uncertainties, but it was no longer the same silence as before. The sound of the heart monitor, repeating that fragile beep, beep, was like a whisper that something greater was at work. And I, as a doctor, knew we had to keep fighting, because the mystery was far from over. Carlos's return was like an electric shock, not only to his body but to all of us. The heart was beating again, but irregular, unstable, like a fragile flame that at any moment could go out. The monitor showed timid, hesitant waves, and I knew this was not the end of the fight, but the beginning of a new battle. The team went into immediate action. Medications were adjusted, ventilation controlled, monitoring intensified. The silence of disbelief gave way to a frenzy of coordinated movements. Every professional knew that, at that moment, there was no room for distractions. Any second lost could mean the tiny spark of life would vanish again. As procedures continued, I did not take my eyes off Carlos. His body, still rigid and cold, seemed reluctant to follow the heart that had decided to return. It is hard to explain, but there was a strange sensation, as if we were facing something that did not fit the pattern. I could hear the team's murmurs. Some spoke of a miracle, others tried to justify it with improbable medical hypotheses, but no one dared to raise their voice. It was as if everyone knew this was not a common situation. Doctor, pressure still very low. We need to stabilize the heart rhythm. Prepare more dopamine, quickly. Those were the phrases overlapping with the metallic sound of the monitors and the rhythm of the machines. It was as if we were trying to stitch life back together, point by point, without knowing if the fabric would hold. At the same time, the image of Carlos's wife did not leave my mind. Outside, she kept waiting, unaware of what was happening at that very moment. For her, it might have been just a matter of minutes until she received definitive news. And I knew that, whatever that news was, it would forever change the course of her life. The most striking thing was realizing how, even in critical condition, Carlos seemed to be fighting somehow. There was no conscious movement, no sign of awakening, but his heart, stubborn, insisted on beating, irregular, weak, but resistant. And that gave us the motivation we needed to continue. One of the nurses, with tear-filled eyes, whispered to me, "Doctor, I've seen many patients give up before we even had the chance to do anything. But this man doesn't want to leave." That phrase stuck in my mind, because that was exactly the feeling in the air. Carlos was not ready to go. Even so, the instability was alarming. Every minute swung between the return of hope and the risk of another arrest. We knew his body was deeply compromised, that prolonged absence of cardiac activity could leave irreversible damage, but none of this was certain. And as long as there was life, even if fragile, there was a fight. So I decided, Let's transfer him immediately to the ICU. He needs continuous advanced support." The stretcher was prepared in haste. The team, still in shock from what had just happened, reorganized with almost automatic synchrony. There was no time to lose. Carlos would be taken to intensive care, where every second would be closely watched. As we walked down the corridor, pushing the stretcher, I noticed how all eyes turned toward us. Nurses, relatives of other patients, everyone watched in silence. No one knew exactly what had happened, but everyone felt that something extraordinary was underway. And it was in that corridor, between the ER and the ICU, that a strange feeling took hold of me. I don't know if it was relief. I don't know if it was fear. Perhaps a mix of both. Because I knew that, from that moment on, we were not only facing a critical patient, we were facing a living mystery, a case that somehow slipped through our hands, even when we did everything to hold it. In the ICU, the environment was different. Softer lighting, the constant rhythm of machines, the discreet presence of the specialized team, created an atmosphere of permanent vigilance. Every detail was observed, every oscillation on the monitors carefully recorded. Carlos was now connected to multiple supports: mechanical ventilation, vasoactive drugs to stabilize blood pressure, multiparameter monitoring. It was as if his body were being held up by an invisible web of threads, each one holding life by a delicate strand. The first days were pure tension. His heart beat, yes, but it could fail again at any moment. I checked on him every hour, and each time I entered the room, I felt that knot in my chest. A question haunted me at every glance toward the bed. Will he make it? Yet something caught the team's attention. Despite the severity, Carlos's body responded surprisingly. Small improvements appeared where we least expected them. His blood pressure, though unstable, showed signs of recovery. Oxygen saturation, with the help of ventilation, held at acceptable levels. Gradually, the initial fragility seemed to give way to a quiet resilience. And it wasn't just his body that showed strength. Outside, his wife remained steadfast. Every day, at the same time, she was there, hands clasped in prayer. She didn't ask for technical details, didn't demand explanations. She only said, with a serene voice full of conviction, "I know he will come back. He has always been a fighter." Those words, simple as they were, reverberated in us. It was impossible not to feel that woman's energy. There was something contagious in her faith, as if it were extra fuel for everyone who entered that room. In medicine, we learn that recovery is made of small steps, and that was how Carlos began to surprise us. On the 4th day, vasoactive drugs were gradually reduced. On the 6th day, his heart already showed a more stable, almost regular rhythm. And on the 7th day, something improbable happened. During the medical round, he reacted to simple stimuli, moving his fingers slightly. The team silently celebrated, but their eyes said it all. It was like watching someone return from a very distant place, little by little, sign by sign. I myself, when holding his hand and feeling that minimal response, was overtaken by an emotion hard to contain. Because, in a way, it was as if he were telling us, "I'm still here." Of course, there were still risks. The prolonged time without cardiac activity left doubts about possible neurological sequelae. Full recovery was not guaranteed. But with every new sign, hope grew. And deep down, we knew we were witnessing something that defied all odds. One night, while reviewing exams with a colleague, I heard him say the phrase that summed it all up. "Mariana, if someone told me this story, I wouldn't believe it, but we saw it. We were there, and I only nodded, in silence. Because the truth is that no graph, no report, no cold analysis could translate what we were witnessing. It was something beyond. It was life, resisting with all its strength, even when it seemed to have surrendered." Carlos was still in critical condition, but day by day, he showed signs that he did not intend to give up. And we, with every heartbeat recorded, felt we were witnessing not only a clinical recovery, but also the manifestation of something greater, one of those rare moments when medicine meets the mystery of existence. They were days of uncertainty, of slow progress and constant vigilance. Every morning, when I arrived at the ICU, I felt that knot in my stomach. Would we have good news today? Or would the fragile balance we had achieved collapse? But little by little, Carlos proved that his story was far from over. On the 10th day, what we had all been anxiously awaiting happened. He opened his eyes. Not fully, not with the clarity of someone waking from an ordinary sleep, but with that lost half-open gaze that signaled the return of consciousness. For us, doctors, it was like witnessing a rebirth. The body had resisted. Now, the mind was beginning to show. signs that it too was coming back. The news spread quickly among the team. Nurses, physical therapists, on-call doctors, all commented, moved, about that man's inexplicable strength. And in the hallway, his wife, who had never stopped believing, was called in to see her husband. I remember how she entered the room, eyes filled with tears, hands trembling, as if she were facing the miracle she had prayed for so long. "Carlos, it's me. You came back to me," she said, her voice breaking. He didn't say anything at that moment. He didn't yet have the strength for words. But when his eyes fixed on hers and a tear ran down his face, we all knew he understood. It wasn't just a physiological reflex. It was emotion. It was life pulsing again, communicating without words what we already felt. He was back. There was no way to hold back tears in the room. Even some colleagues, hardened by years of difficult cases and used to the coldness that the profession sometimes demands, couldn't hide their emotions. I myself took a deep breath, trying to keep my posture, but inside I felt a mix of relief and gratitude. Because before my eyes, I was witnessing the improbable victory of life. The following days were marked by steady progress. Carlos began responding to simple commands, moving his hands, uttering a few words. Each gesture was celebrated as an achievement. His recovery was not immediate, nor easy. It required physiotherapy, patience, and a lot of care. But little by little, the man who had once been declared dead began to reconnect with his own existence. The most remarkable moment, however, came a few weeks later, when Carlos, no longer on mechanical ventilation, asked to see his children. They entered the room timidly, eyes full of tears and restrained smiles. As they approached, Carlos opened his arms, still frail, but strong enough to embrace them. The silence that filled the room was profound. No words could translate what we were seeing. A father, who had crossed the line of death, was now embracing his children again. That reunion was not just a family moment, it was a reminder to all of us that life can be stronger than any prognosis. I watched from a distance, respecting the intimacy of that scene, but at the same time feeling an indescribable emotion. Because I knew we were witnessing something rare, unique, something that could not be explained only by medical techniques or clinical decisions. What happened with Carlos was, in essence, the manifestation of a mystery that goes beyond our understanding. At that moment, the image of his wife praying in the hallway came back to me. She never doubted. And perhaps it was that unshakable faith, combined with Carlos's strength, that opened the space for the impossible to happen. And so, after crossing the deepest darkness, Carlos returned to the light, not only for himself, but for his entire family. And, in a way, for all of us who had the privilege of following his story. After weeks of uncertainty, I finally saw Carlos leave the ICU, walking with slow steps, supported by his children and the wife who had never given up on him. It was a scene I will never forget. That man, who one day had been declared dead before me and my team, was now there, smiling, alive, defying all odds. And I confess, to this day, when I think about this story, I get chills. Because no matter how many years of study or how many medical protocols I follow, there are moments when life decides to surprise us. Moments when the unexplainable imposes itself over logic, and all that remains is to acknowledge that we witnessed something beyond our comprehension. Medicine taught me to respect science, but life, with stories like this, taught me to also respect mystery. And perhaps it is that combination that keeps us human, the relentless search for answers, but also the humility to accept that not everything can be explained. And now I want to speak directly to you, who have made it this far, following every detail of this story. If this narrative touched your heart, if it made you reflect on the strength of hope, on the importance of faith, and on how surprising life can be, then I ask, leave your like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story. This not only helps bring this message to more people, but also keeps alive the memory of moments like this, which must be told. And I have a special request. Write in the comments the phrase, "I believe in miracles," because every comment counts. And I need at least 100 for YouTube to deliver this video to more people who need to hear this message. It may seem like just a phrase, but it is a gesture that connects us all around the same idea, that the impossible can indeed happen. Before closing, I want to leave a reflection. Perhaps you are facing a difficult moment, where everything seems lost. Maybe you are dealing with a situation where you see no way out. But remember, life can change in an instant. Just as it happened with Carlos, when everyone believed it was the end, something unexpected can happen and rewrite your story. And to help you keep reflecting and finding strength, I have already set aside a next video for you to watch. I will not reveal the title now, but I can guarantee it will shake the way you see life, faith, and even medicine. As soon as this one ends, click on the video that is appearing on your screen. I'll be waiting for you there, so we can continue this conversation. Because, in the end, every account I bring here is not just an isolated story. It is an invitation for us to reflect together on the mystery of existence.